Say what you will about the Star Wars prequels, but this shot in the original trailer is still kind of sick. So, I wanted to recreate it. Why? Because Pablo Picasso once said, good artists copy, great artists steal. And I want to learn Unreal Engine 5, so boy oh boy, you know I must steal and learn one hell of a lot in the process. From almost giving up on this project, to learning about PCGs, Niagra, animating along a rail, and so much more, this is how I remade Star Wars with $0. Chapter 1. Getting started. Step 1 was breaking down this scene into manageable chunks. We've got the environment, 3D models,
animation, the sky, lighting, contrails, shrubs, dust flying up, and flares.
There's a lot to get through, but we need to start somewhere. So, let's start with the environment by using the sculpt tool in the landscape editor. Then, let's apply a sand material that can be found on Fab. Next, let's import our 3D model, which is an OBJ. Sometimes OBJs are a pain to import, but if you simply drag and drop your folder into the contents browser and make sure static mesh is selected under force all mesh as type, you should have relatively no issues, other than your mesh being tiny, like this one. This Millennium Falcon is way too smooth by the way, but we'll come back to improve this later. Lastly, I made the backlights emissive by finding the correct material and very simply adding a color node and multiply node. Chapter 2. Failing. Now, bear with me because this next part contains a lot of failure. Importing video and reference. The plan, originally, was to import the trailer video, parent this to my camera, making sure my plane is set to movable, and use it as an overlaid reference. But this didn't really work. Turns out parenting the video to the camera makes matching the camera movements quite difficult. Animating along a spline. Next up, it's time to actually start animating the Falcon. To do this, I first studied the route the Falcon flies in the trailer. Then, I tried to match this path with the spline. At first, I was having difficulty with the rotation of my mesh along my spline, but the solution to this was to bin off the spline, animate along a camera rail rig instead, and select lock orientation to the rail. Then, every 30 frames, or 1 second, I would shuffle along my animation timeline and match up the camera to the original video. My camera is parented to the Millennium Falcon by the way, so I can more easily follow the Falcon throughout the animation. I then continue animating the camera, and even the speed of the Falcon along the rail. At this point, I have spent 2 evenings on this project, and this is what I have so far. Yeah, it's a far cry from the original, but I promise you it will get better, although not before getting worse. I tried animating the camera without it being parented to the Falcon, which didn't work. I tried a couple new rails to improve the route, and I also expanded the environment. I then ran into a problem with the rail's rotation randomly changing. I then made the landscape bigger, but realised that I would have to sculpt all the sand dunes in this whole area. Yeah, not happening. So I found some sand dunes on Fab, removed the exponential height fog to get rid of this really annoying dark line along the horizon. Like, I want my horizon to nicely blend into eternity, please? Anyway, I then only placed sand dunes where the camera would see sand. And then I realised it all looked awful. So I had another look on Fab and downloaded the Realistic Desert Pack. This looked way better. I mean, my rail path was all over the place, but at least now the environment was getting closer to what I was after. Next, I changed the sand on the landscape mesh and I adjusted its tiling parameter to be a much more usable scale. I then adjusted the aspect ratio to be 2.4 by 1, which is supposedly what most widespread theatrical showings use. I mean, 16 by 9 is all I've ever known, so I guess I'll take the word of this random graphic I found on Bing. Now that I had worked on the environment, I wanted to improve the Millennium Falcon model. At this time, I couldn't find anything better, so I decided to create a normal map for this model. A normal map is that pink-purple texture you often see in 3D materials. Normal maps are used to add more detail to an object. Usually this is by using depth and creating bumps or grooves in the model's surface. So I wanted to try and create my own normal map by exporting the texture, right-click, Asset Actions, Export, dropping this into Photoshop, convert it to a smart object, select Filter, 3D, generate normal map, adjust as desired, export, drop back into Unreal, and place the texture in the normal node of my material. And after all of that, it still didn't look that great. In the end, I just fully replaced the Millennium Falcon with a better model, but that presented its own set of challenges. Stick around and you'll see what I mean. In the meantime, I had to keep dealing with the Millennium Falcon doing weird rotations. Then I tried adding a new camera rail, which didn't work. Turns out I added a cine camera rig rail, not a camera rig rail. Please make sure you don't make the same mistake and waste as much time as I did trying to figure this out. At this point it's day 3 and I can't help but feel like this isn't going very well. In fact, it was here I was kind of considering to scrap this whole project. However, tomorrow would be day 4 and the first full day I would get to work on this project. Up until now, it had just been evenings after work, but things were about to get a whole lot better. Chapter 3. The turning point. From here, I assure you things start to look more promising. I decided to start looking at the contrails coming off the Millennium Falcon, and I wanted to use Niagra for this. Now, I've never used Niagra, successfully that is, until now. After 3 failed attempts, I finally managed to get the desired effect I wanted. To create the contrails, I first create a Niagra system, find an empty Niagra emitter, rename it, go to particle spawn and search for add velocity. Then, to fix these issues that appear, you can either press fix issues, or under particle update, add solve forces and velocity. Then, go back to add velocity, and increase the velocity along the z-axis. You know it's the z-axis because it's blue, and if we look in the bottom corner of the preview render, we can see on the compass the z-axis is also blue. Next, you can delete the sprite renderer and replace it with the ribbon renderer. Then, under emitter update, find spawn rate and adjust the value. If nothing is appearing, go to initialize particle, and under the ribbon attribute, change the ribbon width from unset to direct set. This will adjust the width of your ribbon. And now we have contrails. On the subject of Niagra, a few days later I actually adjusted this trail to be more wispy. I did this by adjusting the following. I changed the velocity mode from linear, which makes the trail go in a line, to in cone. I then adjusted the velocity speed to make the trail longer. I decreased the cone angle to decrease the width of the trail. I adjust the cone axis to once again animate along the z-axis. I also adjusted the speed fall off from cone axis, which I think basically affects the top of the trail and how it moves around the cone. I also adjusted the distribution along cone axis, which is to do with the randomness of velocity, with 0 being further from the axis and 1 being closer to within the axis. You can think of the axis as a linear line, by the way. Although this new trail looked really nice and was exactly the effect I wanted, unfortunately the Millennium Falcon was moving too fast in the scene, so it turned out that most of this was for nothing. But at least I learned how to build Niagra systems. Also, if you think I explained any of that wrong, please leave a comment and let me know. I'm still very new to simulations. Oh, by the way, one last thing on Niagra is to adjust the opacity and color, you can go to initialize particle, change the color mode from unset to direct set, and then you can adjust the color, or the opacity by changing the alpha value. We'll come back to Niagra later, as I learned quite a lot more on this project. Next on the list is adding in the TIE fighters. Yes, it's finally time to add in some baddies. I found a really nice model on Sketchfab, which was also downloadable as a .fpx file, the file type I'm most used to in Unreal Engine, due to my love for Mixamo. However, I was surprised to find that when importing my model, it came in multiple static mesh pieces. Now, there's a couple things you can do to fix this. 1, I can select all the pieces and drag it into my scene, then go to Actor, Merge Actors, Merge, and then you will have a new merge static mesh where you can still edit all your materials as normal. Or, the second way of dealing with this is when you import your model, under the Advanced option, you can select Combine Meshes, and this will combine all static meshes in your model before you import them. Unfortunately, with a lot of 3D models that you find on the internet, you will have to make the materials from scratch in Unreal Engine. Usually this is a relatively straightforward process. What I usually do is select the material on my mesh that I'm going to update, then find all the textures that have a similar name to the material. They should all be named relatively similar to the node that you need to attach them to. For example, textures that go into the ambient occlusion node may have AO attached at the end of their name, or a normal map may say normal and so forth. The one that may be a bit confusing is if it says diffuse. A diffuse texture refers to the main texture or colour, meaning this should attach into the base colour node. Then you just need to do this for every material on your 3D model. Now, you might have noticed that this TIE fighter has a few missing areas for some reason, as if the faces of the model are see-through. To fix this issue, go to your modelling tab, make sure to turn on your modelling plugin by the way, go to Mesh Attributes, and select Normals. Here you can select Fix Inconsistent Normals. Press Accept, and you're done. Just be aware this doesn't always work. For example, on the Millennium Falcon model, it was useless. Speaking of which, it's time to find a better model. No offense, Gary, your model was great, but I need a model with a few more polygons. So I found this model by Stim, and then I found this model by Nintendo Obi-Wan, which was the model from Stim, but with the landing gears removed. So shout out to all these guys on Sketchfab. Anyway, this was also a .fbx file, but the materials were all written in what felt like Morse code. So to help me figure out what textures go where, I simply changed the colour of all of them. That way I could see what went where nice and easily. Now the original plan was to simply replace the first Falcon with a new model, but of course, it's never that easy. It was way too big, and it wasn't facing the correct direction. If I adjusted the scale, all the objects parented to my Falcon also scaled down. Then I had the problem of the camera facing the wrong part of the Falcon, and unfortunately, it wasn't as simple as just moving the camera, especially when I had already animated the whole scene. The best solution I figured out was to shrink the new Millennium Falcon to the size of the original one, then rotate it to match. Then using what I learned earlier with the TIE Fighter, I can merge my single mesh, and now when I drop this into the scene, it is the exact same size as the original Falcon, which means now when I go to replace my actor, it's the correct size and facing the correct direction. I was pretty proud of that one, figured it out all on my own. Next I added in the lasers from the TIE Fighters, made a small change to the landscape, adjusted some more animation, and tweaked the colour of the sand, all while constantly looking at the original shot for reference. Now, things are starting to come together at the end of day 5. Chapter 4. Procedural Content Generation. Next on my list was to tackle these shrubs. At first, I considered if I could place the shrub assets by hand, but I very quickly realised that wouldn't be very easy, and take far too long. So, instead, I decided to learn a little bit about PCGs. PCG, or Procedural Content Generation, is a tool in Unreal Engine that allows artists to create random content, aka procedurally generated content, fast and efficiently. A great example of this would be placing trees to create a large forest, placement of buildings in a town, or, in my case, shrubs in a desert. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to use PCGs because I still don't know enough about them myself to confidently recount what I did. So I strongly recommend you check out the following videos in relation to this topic if you are interested. However, I will tell you some of the mistakes I made along the way so you can avoid them. First of all, make sure the plugin is enabled. Yeah, that would be a great start, wouldn't it? Anyway, if you're using a mesh as your landscape, use the mesh sampler and make sure you definitely have the right mesh selected, unlike me. You can use a transform points node to adjust the scale of your PCGs as well as the minimum and maximum scale, meaning my bushes will be randomly given a scale within my chosen sizes. You can also use this node to adjust any offset, basically location, or rotation for your PCG objects. Oh, and lastly, if your density node is not working for some reason, you might simply have to restart Unreal, and then it should work again. Chapter 5. Other. Before I move on to the final bits, I just wanted to mention 3 other things that I learned on this project. 1. If you hit F on your keyboard, you will zoom towards your selected object. Fat-fingered my way to finding that one. To animate multiple keyframes at once, hit Enter on your keyboard. This was really useful when I was trying to animate 2 lasers moving at a time. With a post-process volume, you can add bloom and lens flares. Simply look up either bloom or flare, and remember to set your volume to infinite extent. If you adjust the lens flare's intensity, you can also just have the bloom, and not include the lens flare if you wish. Chapter 6. Compositing. Finally, the last bits I needed to sort for this project was to do with compositing. I wasn't totally happy with how the trails appeared in the cinematic, so I decided to render this out as a separate pass so I could composite it over my footage and adjust the opacity as I desired. To do this, I added in a black plane and parented it to my camera. I then hid all other layers that also may be seen, making sure to turn on Hidden in Game on these objects. This way, in After Effects, I would be able to place my footage and set its blend mode to screen and adjust the opacity of the trails. Please let me know, by the way, if there's an easier way of doing this. I also built a Niagra system to try and simulate the dust kicking up from under the Falcon. This didn't really come out the way I wanted, but I would like to point out a couple of things that I learned. Firstly, if an issue comes up, it's almost always worth selecting Fix Issue. To give your particles a lifetime, you must add an initialized particle and particle state module. you must tick the box for Kill Particle when lifetime has elapsed, and then you can adjust your lifetime parameter in the Initialize Particle module, which will now affect your particles. Particle lifetime is basically the particle coming in and out of the world. If you add a scale sprite size and nothing appears in your viewport, make sure in Initialize Particle under Sprite that your sprite size mode matches your scale sprite size mode. Setting both to uniform is likely the easiest solution. I mentioned earlier you can change the color or opacity of your sprite under the Initialize Particle node. Well, another way you can change it and add animation is by adding a scale color, pressing the little arrow and adding a float from curve. In my example, I have now adjusted the opacity so that the alpha goes from 1 to 0 over the course of 1 second. Next up, if I want to turn these particles into images, I do that by adding a sub-UV animation. Adjust the sprite renderer from none to sprite renderer, then in your sprite renderer, you can drag and drop in your sprite images under material. To make my life easier, I simply downloaded the following starter pack and used the sprite materials found in that. Then, under Initialize Particle, you can increase the uniform sprite size, increase the spawn rate to make more of the little clouds. Then, if I adjust the velocity mode, you can also see the difference this makes in the preview. Next, I wanted the dust to kick up around in a circle, basically as if the dust was only being kicked up around the edges of the spaceship. Although in hindsight this actually seems quite unnecessary, especially considering I couldn't figure out how to do what I wanted it to do. But anyway, I still learned these things in Niagra. I made the Niagra system animate in a ring by adding a shape location and changing the shape primitive to a torus, aka a circle. Then I simply increased the sprite size. You can also make your particles do this by changing the torus distribution method. Pretty cool. Adding this Niagra system didn't really work at first, so I thought I'd slap it on a black background so I could simply composite it in. It's not perfect, but to be honest, I'm running out of time on this project. So now we're approaching the end. I made a number of minor adjustments, then tried adding in a custom lens flare by making this material, placing it on a plane and animating its location and opacity inside the level sequence. Lastly, I chucked in an HDRI, hoping that it would kind of tie everything together, which it kind of did. Then the final bits left were doing all the compositing and colour grading, and well, here's the final result. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a long one and a lot of work, so I hope you got something out of it. Let me know your thoughts, and if there is anything else I could have added that you might have wanted to see, let me know. Thanks for watching.